Hey everyone, we are excited to launch the Brightminds subscription. Unlimited access to all of our CE courses, webinars, and expert speakers all in one place.
And for a limited time for the month of December, you can get 50% off. Normally $299 a year, now just $149 for your first year.
That's unlimited CE on your schedule for half price.
Head over to psychedpractice.com and click sign up, and the discount is already applied. We look forward to seeing you there. And as always, be well, stay psyched. This episode of the Psyched to Practice podcast is sponsored by PAR, where psychological assessments meet innovation.
PAR has been the gold standard in the industry for over 45 years and has empowered professionals in education, healthcare, private practice, and research with trusted tools and cutting-edge solutions.
Discover more at parinc.com. Again, that is parinc.com. Creating connections, changing lives.
Welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one-stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm Ray Christner, and with me as always,
Paul Wagner.
So, Paul, today, got to have a great interview today with Deb Dobson about her book about social anxiety, which is a topic we haven't had on, but one that I know I see pretty often coming up, maybe not as the primary reason in my sessions, but often a part of sessions I'm working with. So this was a really, I think, insightful episode for me and learned a lot from her.
Yeah, I mean, but between her book, and I should call it, her new book, Living Well with Social Anxiety, Practical Strategies for Improving Your Daily Life, and the conversation, just does a great job of just identifying this really wide net of social anxiety and the way that it can really kind of present with some nuance or specificity. And between the conversation today and the book, I was like, yeah, wow, this is, I'm noticing things that were really kind of flying under the radar and starting to talk a little bit more and identifying certain aspects in the session. So I think great overall conversation. And it's I'm really grateful for the resource of the book to refer back to here.
Yeah, it was really, these Living Well books through Guilford are really, kind of meant for individuals to read. But I think, now reading a few of them and reading this one, how many therapy tools I've pulled out of it. And it was great to hear her kind of explain some of those. I won't give it away, but some of the use of metaphor and stuff I thought was really good, and things, I know it's going to kind of change how I work in some of these cases.
For those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. Deborah Dobson, she's specialized in cognitive behavioral therapy throughout her career, particularly in the understanding and treatment of social anxiety disorder. She first began her certificate program in CBT in Western Canada through the University of Calgary, and has provided supervision and training in cognitive behavioral therapy in Canada and internationally. Her textbook, along with her co-author Keith Dobson, Evidence-Based Practice of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, has been adopted by many training programs, and her new book, Living Well with Social Anxiety, Practical Strategies for Improving Your Daily Life, is now part of that new series by Guilford that we're talking about. And, not the first time we've had a guest on, but, just great resources, and also client-friendly resources too.
Yeah, like I said, great, very, very user-friendly, I think, both for individuals and for therapists. And, for those of you listening, we'd love to hear from you if there's something that kind of strikes a chord with you and things that you do. We'd love to hear back from you on social media.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode, Living Well with Social Anxiety.
So, Deb, thanks so much for joining us on the Psyched to Practice podcast. Paul and I are really excited to spend some time and hearing about your work today.
Happy to be here, Ray.
Awesome. We like to start out before we kind of get into the content of your book and the work that you're doing. We like our listeners to just kind of understand your origin story, kind of how you got into psychology and specifically around your focus on social anxiety. So can you share a little bit about that journey?
Okay. Well, it depends how far back you want me to go. I could talk for a long time about that.
That could be a long journey, right?
I got interested in abnormal psychology as an undergraduate student. And then during grad school, I studied actually schizophrenia. And my first area of practice was social skills training for people with schizophrenia. And then I did that for a few years in one of my first positions. And then just by happenstance realized that we had a lot of clients who appeared to have quite disabling social anxiety. I was working in a psychiatric day program at the time, and there was nothing for them. And many of them weren't able to attend most of the treatment available in the program because it was all offered in groups, and they weren't really able to participate in groups. So I saw a gap in the clinic and in the city where I work, and there was nobody really doing anything with social anxiety. And it was early days in CBT for social anxiety. So I began a group and some research that went along with it. And that's how that area started. It started with quite severely ill clients. Some of them many of them, in fact, had comorbid conditions. But that's how it started. And it took off from there. I started a group and did a whole bunch of work on the area up until I wrote the book. Well, it's technically my first book on social anxiety, but not my first book.
Okay.
And so
what led you to wanting to write a book, or specifically this book?
Mm-hmm. Well, I really liked the concept that Guilford Press was starting a new series, and I was approached to discuss kind of the concept. And the concept of the series was that people with psychological difficulties continue to have problems with or without treatment. And I think we've talked about, we've often used short-term treatments when we do CBT, maybe 12 to 16 sessions. And, people tend to make considerable gains with treatment. However, those of us who do a lot of clinical practice know that they continue to have difficulties, and they continue to have either relapses or difficulties during times of transition. And so the concept of the series was, what can you do to help people live alongside their difficulties? It just was a very realistic idea, I thought. And I thought it was showing, both realism and optimism that, we need something for people, not just with social anxiety, but other difficulties as well. So that was the concept for the series. And, particularly with social anxiety, I thought there was a niche and a need for clients.
And I feel like the title of the book lends itself so well to the content of that living well. And it's living well, not living perfectly. And, we'll get to maybe some of those elements. I feel like the book does a great job both of describing the symptoms of social anxiety, but also just the experience of it with some of the case studies and just like that narrowing of, their experiences and their life in a way. Can you share, how do you form in the book to help clients see the long-term cost of avoidance that's relating to social anxiety?
Yeah, no, often there is a shame driving it. And, having seen, I never stopped to count how many clients that I saw over the years, but all of the examples in the book are kind of composites or similar to clients that I've seen. And there's such a range of people with social anxiety, all the way from a person that has a very specific public speaking anxiety or fear of doing something in public to people whose lives are completely taken over and live very isolated lives, really on the fringe of society. And, I think that I wanted to give a sense of hope to people reading the book, a sense of optimism that it's really not just about what is suggested to you by a clinician or by a book, but it's about taking ownership and it's about taking charge. Because if a person doesn't take charge of the problem, they're not going to stay well. And so to live alongside or to live well with social anxiety, really the person needs to understand it. And, I tried to give many examples so that people could hopefully see themselves in some of the examples and, give some examples and so that they understand and really kind of get the nitty-gritty about how it works.
As I was going through, able to connect with some of those examples personally, and our listeners will know that my involvement in the podcast and kind of the formation really came from trying to challenge that public speaking fear and discomfort and a couple other instances and really feeling like it felt limiting. Right. And so taking that opportunity. And so I know the book shares many different ways of talking about exposure and challenging, but it can be quite freeing when taking off, some of those shackles of the shame, the self-doubt, the guilt that's involved in that.
Oh, exactly. And I think almost everyone can relate to social anxiety. I think that, 90% of the population is afraid of public speaking. And so, I would say to my clients, the 10% that aren't afraid of public speaking are the weird ones. I can relate. I used to be terrified of public speaking. And so, it's so common. And I think other aspects of social anxiety, worrying about what other people think of you, wanting to be liked by other people, those are natural responses. And so I think virtually everyone can relate. And I also think virtually everyone can benefit from the strategies discussed in the book as well. You don't have to be diagnosably socially anxious to want to work on public speaking anxiety by doing a podcast.
That's right. Natural exposure there, right?
Exactly.
So with the idea of exposure, we know that there are safety behaviors that can kind of quietly undermine exposure work. And so, what are some of the maybe subtle safety behaviors that clinicians or individuals might miss in sessions? And I guess, how do we help people learn to spot and experiment with dropping those things in the real world?
Yeah, it's tricky, and there's so many different safety behaviors. I have a scale that is in the book, actually, that helps people identify safety behaviors, but certainly that's not all of them. I think all the way from avoiding eye contact to giving away the credit, taking medication before you come to an appointment, having a shot before you go out to a party. I think that if you attribute the credit to someone else, that's, safety behaviors are technically ways in which to reduce anxiety. And so and many therapists think that safety behaviors are sensible. Practicing relaxation in the midst of exposure, that's been debated. Is that a safety behavior, or is that sensible? I think it depends is usually the answer that I say. And, I like to also say, because many clinicians can relate to psychodynamic therapy, safety behaviors are the CBT version of defense mechanisms. They're helping people cope with anxiety. And so in the short term, they may be useful, but it's really helpful to identify them and reduce them and hopefully eventually eliminate them in the long term.
And that's such a crucial point there, like with safety behaviors. And again, so many great examples in the book, but just when there's that identification and really how it robs the individual from the development of the confidence and like their overall tolerance. And so it's, I was only able to get through that because I had that scripted.
Right.
It's something that after reading through the book, it really identified ones. And even in the week that I've been talking about it since, I'm like, in sessions, it's coming up like a part of, I guess, those safety behaviors and just the avoidance as a whole is exposure work is uncomfortable. And there's this desire of, when we experience this anxiety, we want it to go away. Mm-hmm. And, that's our goal of it feeling better. It's like, I don't want to feel this. And how do you, when you're working with clients, how do you try to advocate for them of like staying engaged and tolerating the discomfort is how we have it going away long-term versus that immediate release? Like that. What do those conversations look like?
There's lots of different conversations one can have. One of the things I ask clients is to think about a fear they got over in the past, something that they were maybe afraid of as a child, or maybe we were just talking about, a ski trip that I recently took. I think that if someone does a physical activity that they used to be afraid of and they're no longer afraid of it, or learning to drive, there's a lot of things that we have developed and learned how to do over our lifetime that we used to be afraid of. And if a client can think of some of those and talk about, how did it happen? It may have been, the ski lessons or the driver training lessons, but it's also a whole lot of practice. And when you're learning how to drive, you don't start on the freeway in a big city like LA or New York. You start on neighborhoods and do it gradually and slowly, and you build your confidence. And so that's one of the things that I would have that conversation with clients. Yeah, I'd also say, the best way to build confidence is to do hard stuff. If something is easy, it's not going to help a whole lot. And, clients are often looking for reassurance that everything's going to be okay. And I think as therapists, we have to learn how to sit with our clients with anxiety and not be overly reassuring to our clients. We don't genuinely know that everything's going to be okay. And social situations are less predictable than many. We don't know, we can predict if we have an inanimate object and we're trying to help someone overcome a phobia of that, that's quite controllable. But other people are notoriously uncontrollable. They may do and say and give people looks that the client didn't imagine would happen and I didn't know was going to happen. And so being prepared for uncertainty and not judging themselves by the outcome of the situation, but if they need to judge at all, it's better to take a non-judgmental attitude, but by what their efforts were, what they tried and, how they felt about their own efforts, not by what happened. And so helping clients do that. And again, I just want to say too, it's difficult for therapists because we want our clients to feel comfortable. We want our clients to feel better. And we're notoriously good at reassuring them. I think it's some conversation I've had with every student I've ever worked with is, how to be less reassuring and more helping our clients be uncomfortable. I am reminded of a client that I had, and she was, I would say, an expert client. She understood CBT inside and outside, and she would try to trick me into reassuring her. It would happen near the end of every session. And, I often fell into the trap, and it might have been subtle, like, what do you think's going to happen? Or how do you think that's going to go? And I often would, say, I think it'll probably be okay. And she would then say, gotcha. It was
that unexpected social situation.
It was quite charming, actually.
Yeah. Deb, I want to jump back for a second because I'm kind of picturing our listeners. You made a comment about relaxation can be a safety behavior. And I think many people see relaxation as this core therapeutic tool that we focus on. We hear anxiety, we think about relaxation. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that means and the difference between when it's therapeutically helpful and when maybe it's a safety behavior that might get in the way?
I'm glad you went back to that, Ray, because I kind of jumped over that fairly quickly. And, again, it is debated in the literature whether or not relaxation is a safety behavior or not. But I think if you think about how exposure works, to be effective, the client has to experience a moderate level of anxiety. And, if you teach clients about, the SUD scale, subjective units of distress scale, ideally, they might have anxiety between, say, 40 and 70%. And so if their anxiety is not at that level, they're not going to benefit. They have to experience some anxiety. So if they are, if you think about relaxation, if they're fully relaxed and then trying to do some exposure, it's not going to be, I would say, as effective. It might be somewhat effective, but it's not going to be as effective as if their anxiety is higher. And then they, I will say, power through it, and their anxiety either reduces or they learn that it's okay. They learn that they can tolerate it. And so that's part one of my response. Part two of my response is if you think about, and it's a subtle distinction between safety behaviors and crutches. And so crutches, they may look exactly the same, but there's something that gets you into a situation rather than keeps you out of a situation. So if it's a choice between not doing something or using a crutch, I would say use a crutch. And so it could be relaxation or it could be something else. And so if they use some relaxation and they go to a situation, they're still probably going to experience some anxiety. Or if they're in a situation, and again, I had an example of this in the book with one person who unexpectedly became very anxious at a social function. And if you use that to go to a washroom and do some deep breathing, and then you go back into the situation, that's a completely appropriate use of of relaxation. So again, it's, like a crutch, it helps you either get in or stay in. Another crutch might be having a person with you that is quite socially skilled, but they help you initially, but then you might in future do things more independently.
And now a word from our sponsor. PAR's AI Report Writer is an AI-boosted tool that generates comprehensive reports, including interpretations and recommendations based on scores from a wide range of popular assessment tools. Spend less time on report writing and more time supporting students. Learn more at parinc.com/AI. That is parinc.com/AI. And now back to our conversation.
And I love that you kind of talked about the idea of staying in that moderate level of anxiety. And I think sometimes that's what we miss in exposure work. We take people down too far and we don't get the level of effectiveness. And I've, doing work with like virtual reality therapy with anxiety, it's this, when we're looking at keeping them in that moment, we're taking it down so it's not as distressing, but still distressing enough that they're able to get that, desensitized to that. And I think that's such a good point, and something like when you said it and when I kind of reading the book, I was like, oh, wow, that's really important, I think, for people to really pay attention to. Because I think sometimes people might hear that and say, oh, wait, we shouldn't do relaxation. No, it's how we use it, I think, is important.
Exactly.
So it's a good point. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that if a person is so anxious that they're, having a panic attack, they're so distracted and distressed by that experience, it's not going to be helpful. Whereas if they're completely calm and relaxed, again, what's the point of doing it? And so, but it is difficult for clients. I think, I don't know about you two, but when you're working with a client to try to think about, well, what is it that makes you anxious? It's easy for them to think about the really difficult things, or maybe the really, really easy things, but finding things that are in the middle can be challenging. And so it takes some trial and error and some effort and, try out different things, either in your office or outside the office. So, just finding that sweet spot.
I'm curious for when you're talking about social anxiety with clients, because it can present so drastically different. What does identifying those circumstances look like for them? And because again, there were some examples there where I'm like, whoa, hey, in the book, I'm like, yeah, no, that makes total sense in this context, but I didn't view it in this in that way beforehand. Mm-hmm. How do you go about identifying those forms of social anxiety? And what are some of those cues or some of those warning signs or red flags that you look for?
I would say two main ones, Paul. You could almost say it's a cognitive disorder because the central feature is fear of negative judgment. And so the fear of negative judgment, is always about what does the other person think? And so it can be quite specific if in the sense of a specific social anxiety. Most commonly it's quite general, but that's the central feature, no matter how the patient or the client presents to you. And we have to remember as clinicians that most clients with social anxiety don't come to see us about their social anxiety. They'll come to see us about something else. They'll come to see us about depression, very, very common, panic attacks, generalized anxiety, substance abuse, and underneath it all is the primary social anxiety. So we have to kind of have that viewpoint or be thinking about that. And so, the key one is the fear of judgment. The second one is there's always some kind of avoidance. Yeah. And I think that's not unique to social anxiety. We avoid what makes us anxious. That's perfectly sensible if you think about it in some ways. Why would we do things that make us anxious? So there's always some kind of avoidance. What it looks like will vary from person to person.
And, I love the way that I think the book really talks about avoidance and almost like the seductive qualities that, it's exactly. It's why wouldn't we want to do avoidance? Avoidance is great. Have you ever had that sense of relief that avoidance provides? But it is truly, it's about building that long-term awareness. Yeah. And, avoidance isn't a new topic, but just I really appreciate the way that it was framed and the cost of it as well. And when we compare the cost, oftentimes we recognize we are really living a smaller life as a result.
I know it's so seductive, and I think we all can relate to that. How often have we avoided doing something that we need to do? I've been avoiding coming up to Christmas shopping for days and days and days. So we all avoid what we don't want to do. That's perfectly logical. And it's very seductive. But again, having a hard conversation with clients about what are the costs of avoidance, as you pointed out, living a smaller life, not doing what you want to be doing, not having the relationships you want to be having, not having the work opportunities or the educational opportunities that you might want to have. Lots of people build their lives around avoidance. I think that there's lots of research that shows that people with social anxiety don't achieve as well educationally or professionally. And I've had, I think sometimes when I'm teaching a course, a student will come in prior and ask, are there going to be presentations in this course? And if there are, I'm not going to take the course. And so, that's common among the student population, common amongst, things that people sign up to do. And so, if you ask a client, who's making the decision for you? Is it you or is it the anxiety? Who's in charge here? And I think that, if a person genuinely doesn't want to do things, that that avoidance is okay. If it's not something a person is interested in. I avoid watching horror movies, for example. And, I don't mind that. I don't think it's a problem. And, I did watch a comedy one at Halloween, but that was the extent of my efforts. So I think that it depends on the person's values, and it depends on, what kind of life they want to build. And sometimes people fool themselves too and thinking, well, I didn't want to do that, or it's, not of interest to me. But just having a really, straightforward conversation with clients about why are you avoiding that and what are the costs. And
when you're sharing that, just the personalization of it. So again, it's not a one size fits all when we're talking about avoidance, but it also brings up this thought of when we're talking about either personality traits, so those personal preferences, but also experiences of discrimination or judgment that do have a significant effect. And any kind of advice to clinicians to really, walking that line of whether we're treating avoidance and anxiety, but we're not pathologizing sensitivity or dismissing fears that are grounded in real social risks or discrimination.
It's a really good question, Paul. And I think that having, seen clients with, from different cultural backgrounds, people, with different kinds of diversity experience, people with gender minorities, I think that we have to remember that things can be high risk. And so we certainly want to really think about what we might be recommending and have that conversation with the client. Because the other tricky part is people with social anxiety are often quite eager to please their therapists and may not be particularly assertive with their therapists. And so may or often defer to therapists' opinions. And so as therapists, we have to be particularly careful. And we don't want to recommend something that could put a client at risk. And we don't know. That's sometimes the uncertainty a therapist has to live with. If we recommend, we certainly don't want a client to have humiliating experiences. And I think that, we, as part of our assessment, we certainly want to have had the conversation about the person's family history and, are there risks within the family? Is there a risk of violence? Or is a person in a relationship that has those kinds of risks? Or with someone who's in a gender minority situation, we don't want to recommend something that's going to increase visibility to the point of person experiences discrimination or violence. And so I think that it's a judgment and a conversation we have to have with our clients for sure. And I think that I've done a lot of both individual and group therapy, and it's interesting and useful to have conversations such as this in a group therapy setting as well. And because of the shared experiences, but some of the less shared experiences, if there's the shared experiences would be the social anxiety, but some of the other experiences would be less so. So you can get a range of opinions too.
And I think that's such an important piece. And I'm grateful that you brought up that, one of those other factors that is common is the eager to please and difficulty with setting of boundaries. And I know that the book also mentions the importance of that. And again, some great skills surrounding how we can recognize when we are maybe just trying to justify or, providing an overabundance of reasoning behind a decision or behind a comment, or if we're trying to even engage in boundary setting. I'm curious, when do you view that, I guess, that element of the treatment? Is that something that would benefit before we're even talking about going and engaging in these external exposures, really building some assertiveness skills and the self-reflection and identifying those elements?
And we have to remember assertive skills start with a therapist as well, because I think that, we don't want to teach clients skills, but you can't use them with me. You can't say no to me. And I think that, it's a conversation we have with our client, and some of the initial conversations, I definitely learned the hard way. Another experience I had with clients early on when I was conducting social anxiety group is I would have clients as part of the exposure read aloud and it was often reading maybe a handout or an information package that we had. We had lots of resources that I would use. And little did I think about some of the clients were not able to read. And so it wasn't so much a fear of reading aloud. It was they just simply weren't able to read. And so, that's something that we have to think about as part of our assessment. It wasn't a question that I, was accustomed to asking, because if a client I would get their educational level, but that didn't necessarily mean they could read. And so, and that was creating quite a humiliating experience for the client, inadvertently on the part of the therapist. Another one might be related to finances. If you having a discussion with a client about an activity they might do, being sensitive to maybe they don't have enough money to be able to go to an event or, an activity. And so, just being aware of all those factors. And again, part of these are, not necessarily specific to social anxiety. They're, being a good sensitive therapist and assessing the range of human experiences.
Deb, one of the things that I got from the book and kind of have been thinking about is you talk about that individuals who are socially anxious avoid sharing about themselves, and this kind of fear of being boring, or maybe they're feeling inadequate, and that they rely on this kind of like endless questions, rather than conversation. I guess I'm kind of interested in maybe your thoughts on like some practical ways that people can help clients to practice appropriate self-disclosure and build those connections. I think that one of the metaphors was the conversation as a tree metaphor. Could you share a little bit about kind of thoughts of ways that we can work on that with individuals?
Sure. I think part of this is cognitive work, because I think people don't want to think of themselves as dull and boring, not having anything interesting to say. And so being able to just realize that most people have conversations about kind of everyday topics, not to say boring topics, but everyday topics. So one of the things, and clients sometimes think of this as a bit intrusive, but over listening in on other people's conversations. And so you might be riding a bus or in a public space and kind of listening to what other people are talking about. They may be talking about the weather. They may be talking about, some event that's happening. They may be talking about aches and pains, who knows, but they're often talking about everyday, somewhat boring topics. So realizing, that most of us are a bit boring, and learning to tolerate that. And so that would be one aspect, is looking at those beliefs. The other one that I kind of like to talk about is seeing self-disclosure as on a continuum. And so, when we hear the term self-disclosure, we often think, deep, personal, intimate feelings, thoughts. It doesn't have to be that. And so you can think of exposure as exposure hierarchy or self-disclosure. And so you can start with really small self-disclosures, like, what is your favorite color? And mine is such and such. What part of the city do you live in? So whatever might be a minimal self-disclosure, and practicing that and working your way up. And some of the ones that people with social anxiety have difficulty with is sharing opinions, because for fear it's not going to be the right one. And so taking a risk to recommend a movie, recommend a restaurant, or recommend something you might like to eat. And you can up the ante too, and deliberately recommend a really, really silly movie. And that would be, I think, because people, I often would do these kinds of practices with clients in a group. And, it's kind of fun to recommend, what's the last movie you watched? And people will be scrambling to try to think of the most intellectual thing they ever listened to. but to scale it down and, watch, whatever the silliest Christmas romance comedy is on right now. And
Right.
so those would be some ways, thinking of self-disclosure on a continuum and practicing and trying it out and then working your way up to more personal self-disclosures.
Yeah, I like that you talked about recommending a silly movie or something like that discussion, because I think it's interesting. I think sometimes the most interesting recommendations that people tell me are those silly things. Like they're the ones that, in real conversation, I love when people give me something very intellectual, but sometimes I just love when they give me something that I never thought I would like. And so I love that kind of like that you do that with people, because I think it puts a much more natural conversation in place for people. It's
exactly.
Yeah. Like everything doesn't have to be impressive. It's sometimes
exactly.
It just can be, Hallmark Christmas movies. They're the big, thing at the moment. Right. And they're not that they're great movies, but sometimes we just need that kind of thing. That's
Exactly. We need that, just that kind of thing. And so it's kind of like daring to be boring, daring to be normal. And if you take it one step further, recommending or, taking the risk to say, well, I like, reality TV. I watch The Bachelor frequently, but I think one step more difficult than that would be making deliberate mistakes. And, that's part of exposure, because I think that if we go through life fearing that we're going to make mistakes, that's going to really hold us back from doing anything. And I think that if we can learn, we can make mistakes and nothing terrible happens. And so with clients, we practice making mistakes, and it's a great amount of fun. And because we can drop things, we can spill things. I had one client who was, again, not the same client as the one who asked for reassurance, but a different client who was making so many mistakes, her friends were getting embarrassed. Like she was spilling her water and dropping her coins. And so, if you approach it with a spirit of adventure, I think, and see, it helps you really see it in a different light. And so deliberately making mistakes, they could be speech mistakes, because, if we think about, we fear we might forget people's names during an introduction. And there's lots of different strategies we can use for that. But if we deliberately make a mistake or deliberately stutter or make a speech error, we learn that makes us human, and people will probably like us a bit more than if we were perfect.
I had a client that I was seeing just recently who is worried about criticism. And one of our exposure activities was to actually purposefully drop some of his lunch on his shirt and then to stay in the office and not go home and change.
Good for you.
And it was great. Like it was such a great experience for him. And what he found was, one, how compassionate people were that he was going through that, and that, and said, oh my gosh, I'm sorry that happened. But the other, how many people related to it and said, oh my gosh, I just did that the other day. And it was, it almost normalized that experience of like, we've all done it. Right. And for him, it was so great. So, I just on this idea of, kind of conversations, I just interested in your thoughts on, a lot of times I hear therapists talk about giving people kind of canned conversation starters, things that they can kind of keep in their back pocket that, hey, if you're stuck, here's your 10 go-tos that you can do. What's your thought about using that? Like, is that something that is beneficial as a crutch, or is it something that then we don't have natural conversations? How do you see it?
It's a very good question, Ray. And I think that I would say it doesn't hurt to have a few conversation starters. And I think it doesn't hurt to know how to be polite and to, do basic introductions and so on. So I think there is a role for social skills, and, that would include conversation starters. The tricky part, though, and I think clients need to be aware that you never can predict where a conversation is going to go. And so conversation starters are helpful. And I think along with that, I would say it's helpful for clients to know how to, in a subtle way, learn how to change the topic, because a client may start a conversation about something, and the other person may start talking about something the client doesn't know anything about or is not interested in. And so that's where the conversations are like a tree. You can divert off to a different branch. And so I think there's some skill involved with that, but it's impossible to script conversations with other human beings. I think that, and so learning how to trust, you may be able to learn how to start, but to trust that it'll be okay, to trust that you'll be able to learn how to navigate it, and, take some time, be okay with a bit of silence, be okay with a bit of self-disclosure, asking questions. And so, some conversation starters, yes, I think, but the client probably already has those, I would imagine.
And I like the idea of the tree, because I oftentimes say, listen, if it goes in a different direction, our default response should be being curious. Like if somebody takes it in a different direction, it's okay that you know nothing about it. And I always give an example when I work with kids, they'll come in and say, I want to talk about Pokemon. I know nothing about Pokemon, but being curious about it gives us that conversation. And it's an easy kind of, I find an easy kind of default. If you don't know what to say, just ask good questions.
Exactly. And I think you can share with the client, a client, when they are able to explain something to a therapist, they will feel good about that. They feel that puts them in an expert position, not be it Pokemon or whatever they know a lot about. Right. And so it equalizes the relationship. And I think for clients to be able to learn that in other conversations as well, it's okay to ask questions. And it's learning how it's okay to be imperfect. You don't have to know everything about everything to socialize.
Deb, we're referencing the conversation as a tree metaphor, but there was a great example in the book. I believe it was about the individual who was really the social anxiety surrounding the best man speech, or the toast that was being given, if I'm remembering correctly. And the way that I think it was broken down there, really demonstrated it well. But for our listeners, can you kind of break down what that conversation as a tree metaphor really looks like, and what we're talking about here?
And so, it is a metaphor, and it certainly has some limitations, I would imagine. But if you think about the trunk of the tree, that would be where the conversation starts. And it may start with hi, how are you doing? What have you been up to? And then almost immediately, there's going to be a branch. I'm using my hands here, but a branch off the tree that is not as big as the trunk, but it may be, person may be describing some upcoming event, and the other person will maybe ask some questions about it. And then it might branch off into another topic. An upcoming event might branch off into, I've got, 2 weeks off work for a vacation. And it might branch off into whatever their job is about. And so that's a sub branch. And so it can go into little branches, and sometimes can go back to the original topic as well.
And, I think so valuable, because it then doesn't feel like it takes a structure rather than a script. And it's like, okay, we know that the conversations are going to generally follow this. We have our initial starting point, and we're going to deviate, it might be a really tight conversation. So we might not have a lot of branches, or it might be very expansive and
Right.
might be really wide, but ultimately the same structure, but a way of informing and giving a bit of direction without it being too scripted or too, all right, they're going to say this and you're going to say this, and then they're going to say this.
Right.
And that over preparation of trying to get it right versus understanding the flow of it.
Yeah, exactly. The flow of it, because it's going to deviate, it's going to branch off, and that's natural and that's okay. Exactly. You can't script it. Otherwise, it's going to be a pole, I guess, rather than a tree.
Yes. And, you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to pull back of like what brings clients into the therapy setting. It isn't, oftentimes that they're looking to challenge their social anxiety, but rather it might be depression or substance use. And what do you think are the important factors to notice, especially when working with certain populations? Again, I think the book references how substance abuse is one of a significant risk factor and maybe secondary presenting factor of social anxiety, because it is, if I take this shot, or liquid courage or whatever that may be, but how do we really balance the treatment of, what they're coming in for, along with the identification of the underlying root being social anxiety and really the shift here?
It's again a good question. I think that, we used to do treatment more sequentially than concurrently, but we don't so much anymore because, a person may have a substance abuse problem, but not be able to attend something like AA or a group approach because of their social anxiety. And so I would, if it's identified that they've got both difficulties, I don't treat substance abuse, but I would get them in treatment at the same time and try to integrate it and consult with the other parts of the treatment. It would be different in the case of depression. I think that, but the nice part about treatment for depression is that the treatment for social anxiety works pretty well for depression as well. I once was doing an outcome evaluation on treatment for social anxiety. I happened to be using the Beck Depression Inventory, and the depression actually changed as much or more than the social anxiety. And so it works pretty well. And that makes sense because people are more activated, they're around people more, and so their mood is going to improve, particularly with an underlying social anxiety, because that it's depressing to be isolated. It's depressing to be alone and not being able to do the things you want to do. That individual may also, depending on the extent of the depression, benefit from a consult or an assessment specifically. Maybe they might need medication treatment at the same time.
And you're sharing that, I'm also thinking about, and I'm forgetting about how it was named in the book, but the different maybe stages of social anxiety and like the anticipation element of it, the actual experience, but then also the evaluation afterwards.
Yeah.
And I know we're talking about the actual experience oftentimes, but can you speak a little bit to the how we can identify and support through anticipation as well as through that maybe overly critical self-evaluation afterwards?
And I think that anticipation is often the hardest, and it's often what leads people to avoid. Anticipatory anxiety, if you're anticipating something's going to be horrible, it's easy to talk yourself out of it. And so helping clients learn that, what they are experiencing before a situation is absolutely not accurate because they haven't done, they can't be afraid of something they haven't done. That doesn't even make any sense. And so if clients can learn that, but it's a bit tricky because clients often, if they know something is coming up, they will say, well, I want to be surprised. I don't want to know something is going to happen because I'm going to worry about it for weeks in advance. And, I'll go in and I'll be having panic attacks in advance. So if clients can learn to understand the sequence, the anticipatory anxiety is often the hardest. The situation itself is, it's sometimes a bit of a letdown. It's not as hard as expected. But the after part can be pretty tricky as well because clients will often think back, why did I say that? Why did I do that? I looked like such a fool. They may ask somebody, how did I come across? Did I make a lot of mistakes? And so that can lead to lots and lots of post-situation anxiety as well. And so, it's a difficult process. And the in-situation is probably the shortest and the easiest of it all. So if clients can learn, the anticipation is, people are just fooling themselves really into making predictions they don't know are accurate or not, and learn, using some good cognitive therapy there, learning to understand the catastrophic thinking or the, negative predictions and so on. Engaging in the situation and then understanding the after part as well, because there's a lot of cognitive distortions that happen there as well. And there may be times where people do reach out and ask for reassurance, like, how did I come across, or did I offend you in some way? And it can be helpful actually at times for people to realize the other person can't even remember what happened. And, or if they say, well, you did, maybe, you weren't perfect, but it didn't have any consequences. So it can be useful in those situations, not repeatedly, because people will ask for reassurance all the time. And, that's not, that's clearly a safety behavior.
Deb, with social anxiety, I know there's this thought that it tends to resurface, whether due to stress or transitions, life changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm interested in kind of from your perspective, what mindset shifts do you think are most important in helping clients stay resilient and keep practicing maybe after therapy ends? So kind of that maintenance piece. What are some important factors?
Mm-hmm. It's important to prepare clients and to do a good phase of therapy for relapse prevention, and to be realistic. I will say, well, I think that they're guaranteed there's going to be stress in your life. Guaranteed. If you're living your life without stress, you're probably avoiding everything. And so there will be stress, and, preparing them that if there are times where demands are higher, especially social demands, or there's big changes in life, I think that it follows a pretty clear pattern. Social anxiety tends to be diagnosed, early on, late adolescence, when young adults are, expected to be more independent, expected to make more decisions, structure their own lives more than have it structured by others. And so realizing during times of transition that might be starting a new job, might be a new relationship, it might be, having more demands on the job, expected to travel or to entertain or to do interviews. And so if they know, and again, it depends on the individual as to what their particular sensitive points are, but these can be identified over the course of therapy. And so I usually with clients would write up with them a relapse prevention plan. And that may include participating in a support group of some sort, if that's available, or re-entering therapy for a few booster sessions. I used to, or I have said to clients, we see our dentist twice a year, usually for our annual or a biannual checkup. Why not go see your therapist twice a year? I had a client call me once asking for her 6-month checkup. It took me by surprise that someone actually listened to what I said. But I think that's a wise thing to do. And so looking at, are there signs of risk and what can you do about it? Just normalizing it all.
And Deb, maybe one maybe last thing here before we start pulling back. The book, you share kind of like the 4 Ps and I think it's a great way of kind of helping to frame, the way that treatment works and kind of the overall experience. Would you mind sharing the 4 Ps here?
Okay, hopefully I can remember them because I sometimes change the Ps. I can be a bit corny at times, and so if I remember correctly, patience. So we have to be patient with ourselves. Pacing. Persistence equals progress. So I think that's right.
I believe so, yes.
I think, but persistence, I think that I've sometimes equated change with learning a new language. We have to persist and we have to practice too. And so we got 5 P. Yeah, exactly. And so I think we have to practice. We have to, and again, the pacing is important too, because we were talking earlier about the sweet spot for exposure therapy. I think that it's more important to do something every day than to do one big hard thing every year. That's why sometimes public speaking anxiety is a bit tricky, because, many people aren't called upon to public speak really regularly. And so doing something frequently, you'll make a lot more progress than if you do a big thing every once in a while.
So, Deb, this has been just fantastic. Such great information. But as we're kind of wrapping up, we kind of like to end our show with 2 questions we ask all of our guests. The first being, if you could recommend one piece of content, whether that be a book or a movie, TV show, any of those things, for people in the profession, what's something you'd recommend for them to check out?
Oh, that's a tough question, Ray. There's so much out there. I read a lot of novels. I'm watching a lot, we're talking about romance, comedy movies. I would say allow yourself to be silly and watch something goofy. I'm going to watch the next episode of Survivor tonight. And so just allow yourself to be silly, not always intellectual.
The other question, or kind of the last piece is, if you were going to give our listeners maybe 3 takeaways or gems from this episode, what are the 3 things you would hope they remember?
Mm-hmm. I only 3, but the first one that comes to mind, and I was thinking about it with the previous question as well, is be kind. We live in a world that people, social media, and so it's not so kind, I would say. So be kind both to yourself and to others. I think that the vast majority of people are well-meaning and kind, and so that's number 1: is be kind to yourself. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is to do a little something every day to push yourself. And, I think that I can't take credit for this phrase, but a colleague and I have done some workshops on exposure therapy, and we use the term random acts of exposure. And so, we had the random acts of kindness campaign in the world a few years back, but random acts of exposure. So it doesn't have to be super structured and complicated and therapist driven. Just take the opportunity to practice exposure. It may be saying hello to a cashier. It may be, doing something a bit silly, like we all have cell phones, asking somebody for the time when you have your cell phone right there. So doing little things every day. So random acts of exposure. And the third one would be, and this may, I don't mean it to sound harsh, but remembering it's not all about you. Everybody's not looking at you. Everybody's not judging. And to think about if you're inside your head, probably many people are as well. Mm-hmm. So that's number 3.
That's awesome.
Probably others I could think of.
There's always those are great. Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing this. This has been really great. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and coming off of a ski trip to spend some time with us. So thanks so much, Deb.
Thank you. No, it was fun. Thank you very much. And I appreciate your questions as well and your interests.
Great.
Again, just to mirror that, thank you so much, Deb, and for joining us on today's episode. And oftentimes when we're talking to authors, we like to ask, if you have any areas that you'd like for our listeners to check out, whether that's social media or websites, where can they go to follow your work?
Being in a semi-retired position of life, I don't have a website anymore. I used to for many years. Certainly Guilford Press is, I've been on the podcast today and there's been a number of other media interviews that I've done in the last few weeks. So the Guildford website is keeping track of those. So there's links there that can be checked out.
And if you're a licensed clinician and you'd be interested in using this information, please head over to www.psychedpractice.com or check the show notes for a link to check out and purchase an accompanying exam for continuing education credits for this episode. If you're interested in hearing more, staying up to date with what's going on for Psyched to Practice, you can visit our website, or you can follow us on all major social media by searching Psyched to Practice. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, be well, stay psyched.